Welcome to the Standard Deviations podcast, presented by Orion Advisor Solutions and hosted by Dr. Daniel Crosby, Orion's Chief Behavioral Officer and New York Times best-selling author. Each week, Dr. Crosby interviews a fascinating new guest on a range of compelling topics, from literature to psychology to financial wellness. To learn more about Dr. Crosby's behavioral finance work at Orion, visit www.orion.com.
Hello and welcome to the Standard Deviations podcast. I am your host, Dr. Daniel Crosby. I am joined today by Tim Maurer. Tim is head of wealth management at Triad Financial Advisors. He's the author of Simple Money, and he can rock a bow tie like no one I've ever met before. Welcome to the show, sir.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, so we were just talking. I'm just back from the Future Proof conference. Someone came up to me to compliment me on my presentation and said, you know who you should meet? You should meet Tim Maurer. And I was happy to tell the gentleman that we would be speaking just 2 days hence. So here we are. Tim and I connected over, among other things, a love for behavioral finance and a love for Viktor Frankl's ideas. So that's how we're going to spend today in this very niche-y, nerdy place. And Frankl's brand of therapy is known as logotherapy. The logos in logotherapy means meaning or purpose. So I think Frankl's ideas feel very familiar and very comfortable to many of us today in this kind of do what you love, follow your passion type world we live in. But at the time, they were revolutionary. I mean, this represented a sharp break from the ideas of will to power or Freud's deterministic worldview. And so in Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, if the listeners have not checked it out yet, I know Tim and I both would have you check it out. For me, it's like your ticket to the human family is having read this book.
Wow.
But in Frankl's book, logos is what sees him through the horrors of concentration camp life. But Tim, it can seem sort of abstract to ask a client, what is your meaning of life? What is your purpose? So what have you found helpful in helping clients to articulate their life purpose in a practical way?
You're right. It can seem abstract. And what I've also seen is a number of advisors struggle to find a way to ask this question. Like they get the idea that life planning is an important, if not vital part of financial planning. But when it comes to how do I actually engage this conversation, I've seen scores and scores of highly qualified advisors who seem to almost fear this part of planning. And I do say this part of planning, by the way, we could discuss later, that I believe we are instructed, even as CFPs, textbook financial advisors, to be doing this work, life planning work, qualitative discovery. But it is a place that I think a lot of advisors are attracted to, but still hesitate to delve into because of what you just said. It feels abstract. It seems kind of woo-woo out there, like now I'm some sort of psychological sage that I really don't feel like. So I think the most effective way to draw out someone's life purpose is to demystify the process entirely. Demystify it. While it's absolutely true that people want to discover meaning and purpose and allow it to direct their lives and their financial planning, I think many clients would find that a loftier goal than they necessarily expected to delve into with their financial advisor, right? They might walk through the door literally just because one trigger went off. They're about to go on vacation for the first time out of country with 2 little kids. And that was the trigger that made them think I should go talk to a financial advisor. Or maybe just they experienced a crazy market downturn. Who knows what it might be, but there's some sort of trigger. It probably wasn't a desire to figure out what their life's purpose is. Therefore, I think we have to demystify it. The way that I do that is by simply saying, hey, we want to know what's most important to you in life to ensure that your financial planning is supported by your top priorities. Basically, I just want to get to know you better so that we can ensure the financial planning aligns with who you are, so that we can ensure the recommendations that are made are actually in keeping with what's most important to you in life. And when you demystify it that way, when you bring it to a more grounded and practical place, I feel like that's what helps both clients and advisors usher into this territory that can oftentimes seem kind of scary or unfamiliar.
Yeah, woo woo, woo woo was the word that I was thinking of too. And I have about 100 pages of notes on this sort of meaning of life purpose book that I want to write one day, that I'm just sort of always aggregating ideas and quotes and concepts for, in no particular hurry. But when I tell people this, they kind of almost like they almost like roll their eyes, because
Yeah.
it's like, the whole notion of, that there could be a book about the meaning of life seems sort of hard to get your arms around. And I totally get that. So I like your framing though. Like, what are your top priorities? It takes the mysticism out of it and it makes it this really practical thing. And, Frankl and others talked about this idea. Here's the philosophical term for it, is an existential boundary experience. But it's these moments when, right, like you get in a wreck, or you go on a vacation, or whatever, as someone you love passes away, and you have this brush with the awareness that you won't always be around. And it catalyzes something. It catalyzes a sense of urgency in you to update that financial plan, to seek out a financial advisor. And these existential boundary experiences, we need to think of a less goofy name for them. But these existential boundary experiences present a rich opportunity for advisors to say, hey, let's figure out your values, let's figure out your priorities, and create a financial life that aligns with that.
Yeah, and it might feel a little reductive to say, all right, existential boundary experience, let's just call that a life event or a life transition or something that happened in life. Because the truth is, it's pretty darn close, right? And if you start throwing out existential boundary experience, the chances are pretty good that then you're going to scare somebody off.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's being, having been an academician that has worked, most of his career in finance. I think one of the big things that financial planning does well is taking some of these sort of lofty mystical ideas and translating them into words that are a little more palatable. So, in the book, Tim, Frankl gives 3 ways that we can create meaning in our lives. And this is something I think about a lot. The first of these is by creating a work, right? This could be, writing a book. This could be starting a business, any of these things, but by doing something, by creating work. The second way, he says, is by fully experiencing something or loving someone, like getting out in the world, getting your hands dirty. And then the third way, he says, is by adopting the right attitude toward the inevitability of suffering. Frankl also has this great quote about people have increasingly more and more have the means to live, but nothing to live for. I've seen this, and I'm sure you've seen this, with really exceptionally wealthy, high net worth and ultra high net worth clients who have all the means they will ever need, but don't always have a meaning to live for. What have you seen be effective from a life planning perspective for wealthy clients who fall into this category?
This can be a really fun one, but it is oftentimes a tough one. And perhaps especially because one of the ways that these people became so visibly successful or externally successful may have been because they did create a work, right? And something that took off, that did really well. But that alone was not sufficient in order to give them a sense of meaning and purpose, or somehow the meaning and purpose that may have inspired their work has receded. Or maybe it never existed. Maybe it was just that they came up with a new invention for the greatest mousetrap. And that was never their meaning and purpose, because we often forget that too, right? In this whole world of follow your passions, oftentimes your passion isn't necessarily going to be your occupation. I think you and I probably have the privilege that our passion is our vocation. That's certainly how I feel, but that's not how it works for everybody. I'll tell you a funny story about this. I mean, it's funny, but it's a little bit sad. I was once interviewing a genuine billionaire who will, of course, remain nameless in this example. But I asked him, after talking about his work for the bulk of the conversation, I asked him what it was that he enjoyed in life outside of the professional domain. And honestly, he struggled. There was silence. There was pause. It was the first moment in the conversation where I sensed awkwardness. And the best he could come up with was a mention of some of the boards that he was on, that his wife was on. He literally struggled to translate down from on high of this incredible, undeniable business success to what it was that he actually enjoyed in life, what it was that gave him a sense of meaning. And there certainly was discernible meaning from the boards that he was on even. It was almost like that was checking a box. So I think that it can be a challenge sometimes when somebody is so visibly successful, because the general perception that we build up is, well, they've made it. Everything is working out in their lives. But I'll also tell you this, Daniel, when you can crack through for somebody in this place and discover that genuine meaning, the possibilities are amazing, because that's maybe the whole point of financial planning, is aligning financial resources with true purpose and meaning. And so if these people have managed to check the box in a million different ways, or billion different ways in this case, of having the resources, what could we do? What could we inspire if then they back into finding a greater sense of meaning and purpose? And how could that meaning and purpose be fueled by those incredible financial blessings?
Yeah, so I had a mentor when I was back in Alabama who was a very wealthy individual as well. And he was a bit of a business and personal mentor. He sold his business for, again, like the person you mentioned, an incredible amount of money, and then had this sort of loss of self afterward. He would sort of not jokingly refer to himself as a former person. And he even had business cards. Wow. Even had business cards made up that said, so-and-so former person. Because once, he built this business up, this incredible business up over a series of decades, was a best-selling author, et cetera. And then when he sold the business, he had all this wealth, like the culmination of all this hard work and preparation, but he had sort of lost his sense of who he was because that business had been so central to his personhood. So for us as an industry and for the financial advisors that listen to this, is it on them, at least in part, to help a client like this discover that new passion, discover that new purpose? I mean, is that part of the job description? And how would we begin to go about that?
It certainly is not on them to discover it, but perhaps to create the space for a client to discover it, right? It's not determined that if you even follow the best life planning approach on the planet, that the end result is going to be somebody absolutely finding their purpose, right? You could be George Kinder, sitting down with somebody, navigating the entirety of the Evoke system and the 3 questions. And I'd be willing to bet that the vast majority of the time, that's going to happen, but not necessarily. The ends are still in the hands of the clients, whereas the means are in our hands. And so I do believe that we can drastically improve the probability that someone finds that sense of meaning and purpose through our work even. But ultimately, it does come down to them. And that is the whole point of an empathic approach to financial advising. Another word that's overused these days, behavioral finance and empathy. But at its truest level, that's what it's about. It's that it is in the client's hands ultimately. And the best we can do is create the space for them to explore it, for them to discern it, and then we can help them activate it.
Well, it's a beautiful segue into my next question. Frankl's. I'm trying to introduce the listeners. I'm really hoping everyone will listen to this and go deep dive on Frankl after this and become as nerdy as the two of us are. Frankl has these 3 fundamental truths, and the first of these is that every person possesses a healthy core. The second is that therapy, or for our purposes, life planning, financial planning, is about highlighting internal strengths, tools, and resources that already exist. And then the last one is that life offers purpose and meaning, but doesn't insulate us from suffering.
Yeah.
So, let's start with those first 2, because I think behavioral finance has, at least in the recent past, taken you're broken, let me fix you posture.
Yeah.
That sort of is irrationality first and doesn't necessarily honor Frankl's ideals. So, going with this, I like what you said about creating the right environment, having this sort of client-centric, positive psychology kind of view that the answer is within them. how can we sort of practically communicate to clients that they are whole, and practically how do we create the environment that allows them to draw on these internal resources and arrive at the answer for themselves?
Oh man, this is my biggest frustration with behavioral finance within the realm of personal finance right now, and maybe behind behavioral finance in general. Because I think if you ask people about it, it's almost been, at best, a kind of cocktail party trick, and at worst, something that writers and even financial advisors use to shame their clients into saying that you're just one big ball of bias. You're just a huge mistake. You're just the elephant, if you will, using Jonathan Haidt's analogy, a big dumb elephant. I am the brilliant, rational rider that's going to point you in the right direction. You're just a big fat system one, which is kind of worthless in Kahneman's terminology, and I'm your system two. So listen to me. That's a bunch of garbage. And it's actually in direct conflict with these first two truths that you just mentioned that Frankl is suggesting, because what he's basically saying is the ability to find that purpose, and that purpose itself resides within you. And what we unfortunately are telling people, at least with this cocktail party version of behavioral finance, is you're actually all screwed up and you're probably not going to make the right decisions. It's one of the reasons I don't know if you've interacted at all with Dr. Maurer Statman. He wrote this great book, behavioral finance professor out on the West Coast, wrote this great book, ebook now that anybody can download, I think from the CFA Institute's website, called Behavioral Finance, the Second Generation. And if I was to summarize the entirety of this work, he doesn't eviscerate everything that we learned in Behavioral Finance 1.0. But what he does do is turn our gaze toward the fact that, yes, we do have particular hard wiring that we have now labeled a bunch of biases, and maybe that's a convenient term, but he explains that it's not necessarily like a bug, it's a feature. In other words, we were designed that way, if you will, or we are wired that way for a reason, and it actually makes perfect sense. And then once you understand the explanation behind that, then we can use that knowledge to help ourselves make better decisions. But I think that one of the ways that I personally try to communicate the truths of behavioral finance when it comes to working with clients is that I don't talk about it. I don't use the word bias very often unless it's a particular situation. I don't use the word behavior or phrase behavioral finance very often. I use the knowledge that I have, however limited, in this area to create a better environment in which for clients to flourish, hopefully within the course of our meetings.
Yeah, it's interesting. This is really kind of the new zeitgeist, I think, in behavioral finance. You're really seeing this in his other book, Maurer Statman's other book, I believe, is called Finance. He has a couple, but one is called Finance for Normal People, and or some, something like that. I'm spacing the title, but it's Finance for Normal People. And even in some of the work we're doing at Orion, the sort of behavioral finance 1.0 message has been emotions bad. You need to be sort of an investing sociopath, or sort of this automaton, right? Or this robot that just moves through the world of money really systematically. And I mean, look, there is some truth to excessive emotionality clouding certain types of decisions. But we also have information that priming people with emotion at certain times can help them make good decisions. People who are reminded of their purpose or were shown a picture of their family were less likely to go to cash and more likely to save. So there's a lot of these things. I think we're refining and deepening our understanding. Behavioral finance is really a new discipline.
It is.
I think we're refining our understanding, and we're taking a more compassionate, a more human-centric approach that's sort of deeply informed by Frankl's ideas here.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you brought up the word emotion, because for too long, it's been a four-letter word in the realm of wealth management, financial planning, and personal finance, right? It's been synonymous. An emotion has been synonymous with something bad. And I love the point that you make. While yes, sometimes overly emotionalized decisions can be made poorly, emotion is also oftentimes the source of our resolve. which is kind of an ironic twist. It's one of the things that will actually keep us in the game when we are just pointed in the right direction of the effective utilization of that emotion.
Yeah. It's more about adaptive and maladaptive applications of these things. And I mean, we see this throughout psychology, right? Like so a soldier who learns to hit the ground when he hears a loud noise, that's very adaptive. If you're in the theater of war, when you get back home and a car backfires, that's no longer adaptive. And I think behavioral finance is the same way. We have all these different applications. They're not right or wrong so much as they are, situationally appropriate or inappropriate. And it's good to see. It's good to see the industry moving that way. Tim, we our advisors sit with clients through some of life's hardest moments and deal with many of the topics that Frankl talked about. Advisors are front and center when there's a loss in the family, when there's a tragedy, when there's a divorce, when there's a business failure. Does Viktor Frankl or does logotherapy have anything to teach us about how to connect with clients during a time of great sadness or personal distress?
I think it does. I think that a too quick review of Frankl's work could leave someone thinking that it is a morbid topic, because he does focus on the value of suffering. But who among us, with any amount of experience in life or financial planning for that matter, has not learned that indeed pain is one of our great unifiers? It's one of the universal experiences that we all have. And so I think that logotherapy also teaches us that, yes, these hardest moments in life that you just referenced aren't the exception, they are the rule. That's one of the things that we have to come to grips with. Now, remember this too, that one of those biases or cognitive explanations that we've learned from behavioral finance that I do think is helpful is that we tend to feel negative things or pain as substantially more than the joy on the other side of that. In other words, we feel pain more powerfully than we do joy or happiness oftentimes. So therefore, when we have the ability to help someone prepare for, endure, and recover from challenges in life, which I think is actually one of the most interesting explanations of what financial planning is, right? It helps people prepare for, endure, and recover from life experiences, life events, both positive and negative. When we think about it that way, when we can diminish a lot of those external elements of some of the negative consequences that people will naturally experience in life, we can powerfully impact them. Because if we can reduce that pain that generally people feel more powerfully, that's a pretty amazing thing, right? And so we have the ability to help people experience that negative stuff that they are definitely going to experience if you work with them long enough. We have the ability to lessen the pain of that experience really quite dramatically. And what a powerful opportunity for us.
I'm not sure I've ever heard a definition of financial planning that I liked more than the one you just set forth, which is to help people prepare for and endure and recover from sort of the trials and tribulations of life. And, the other thing we know is that our memory is heightened. You talked about this sort of imbalance between how we experience joy and how we experience pain or suffering.
Yeah.
And we know that sort of evolutionarily, we're wired to have better memory for bad stuff.
Yes.
So the corollary here, though, is for advisors, your clients are never going to forget how you acted during a period of need or want in their lives. So it's an incredible opportunity for you to deepen that rapport, to provide real value for them. And, Tim, when I was a therapist, I had to remind myself to just kind of like take a breath and sit back and think, like, this person is talking to me, random, near stranger, before this relationship began. And I am going to help shepherd them through this difficulty in their life. Like, that is a massive honor. And so I think that we as an industry have to be, I don't know, I think we have to be humble and appropriately respectful of the fact that we get to sit with and hold our clients' hands through these periods of pain and transition. The other thing, if, we're going to give lots of book recommendations today, but, I'm so personally influenced by the existential and the Stoic literature that talks about an awareness of loss or impermanence as sort of the pathway to a better life. And, I have this bracelet that my daughter made for me that says memento mori on it, which is, of course, this phrase that says, effectively remember that you're going to die. Like, remember that you're just a man. And it's not depressing to me. No. It's sort of a call to arms. It's a call to action. And so all these heavy things that our clients bring to our door, they're first and foremost a huge honor. And secondarily, they're a time for us to be of real assistance and a time for us to lay a relational foundation that will never go away.
Yeah. Yeah, you gave me chills when you said that, because I've been in this business for 23 years. And immediately when you referenced that kind of that honor of being in that place, just pictures of clients who just in enduring life had come to tears in the midst of a meeting. And just think about how powerful that is. I mean, if you ask a room full of financial advisors, it doesn't matter whether it's 10 or 1,000, and you say, if everybody there had been in the business over 10 years, how many of you have had somebody cry in your office? Yeah. I guarantee you over 80% of the hands are going to go up. It's just inevitable that it happens. And I think especially, perhaps ironically, if you're doing it well, you're going to end up in situations where people are expressing to you some of the stuff that they may have feared expressing to others, perhaps only because initially they had financial consequences associated with them. But nonetheless, they're getting there. And that is a privilege and an honor for us as advisors. And so how much better if we are capable and trained in knowing how to operate in those moments?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Incredible to keep in mind. And I will be using your 3-part explanation of what financial planning is henceforth. So,
you're welcome to it.
Yeah, thank you. With appropriate credit always. So I want to talk about some sort of specific bag of tricks from logotherapy. Frankl sets forth 3 in his really concise little book on the art of logotherapy. I want to talk about each of them in turn. The first of these is de-reflection, which is based on self-transcendence and speaks to turning our attention from our own worries, struggles, and stressors to focusing on actually being of benefit to others. So I know that the planning process can sometimes be sort of solipsistic or sort of inward focused, but is it ever appropriate for an advisor to be prescriptive and say, look, you're all set here. Like, you've got all the money you need. Have you thought about helping others instead of just trying to accumulate more? When we know from the research that there's only a few ways that money can buy happiness, and one of them is giving money away. So is it ever appropriate for us to sort of introduce this to clients who are not sort of naturally inclined towards altruism or philanthropy?
Yeah, man, this is a tough one, Daniel. Thank you. You're giving me all the easy ones, but I think this is tricky, especially because I actually don't believe that we can effectively compel people to be altruistic or compel altruism out of people. In other words, being an external force. I really believe that at least optimally or most effectively, it needs to be impelled from within. But if we genuinely believe that people are drawn to meaning, as Frankl suggests, then that means it's in there somewhere. I just think that it might not always be the most direct and confrontational, quote unquote, approach that does the most effective job. So let me give you an example. I could ask a client, exactly what you just said. Hey man, you won the game. Now, is it time to start looking at others and helping people with all this money you've got? You could do that. But it comes across as a little bit judgmental. And I know that's not what you were intending, but I've heard advisors say this very thing. You could also then take one slightly softer step and say, so talk to me about your charitable inclination, your philanthropic inclination. But again, a lot of people don't think of themselves as charitably inclined or philanthropic. They don't give themselves those labels. So if we further, remember, we talked at the beginning about demystifying. What I will do is create the space for them to talk about their interests, causes, hobbies, passions. Like there are a handful of other words right there where you almost always find something that is altruistic within that, right? Somebody who does not say that they're generally altruistic or charitable, you find out they foster dogs. I mean, that's one of the most selfless or sacrificial things that somebody could do, especially that fostering, because you're not even getting that enjoyment long term. You're probably getting a problem case. It's going to be a real big challenge. It's probably going to destroy a meaningful portion of your house, and then it's going to move on. So to me, that's one interesting way of finding something that has that meaning at its core, but doesn't necessarily have the labels that we have stacked on top of it. And in so doing, you might be able to, as Mr. Kinder would say, light the torch, right? Like, but from within, and you're allowing them to be the ones to do it, as opposed to compelling them to do it.
Yeah, that's so important, and it drives home the importance of framing, because we know from the research that the average $5 million client doesn't view themselves as wealthy. You ask people who are enormously wealthy by global or even national standards if they're wealthy, and most of them will say no. And you can certainly see the same thing being true of asking someone whether they're charitably inclined or philanthropically inclined. And I think the average high net worth client is going to see that as pertaining to people who are sort of above them in the financial food chain, but then they have all these organic impulses to do good in the world that I just don't think they would label as charity. Yeah. So you, I think, brilliantly articulated how to sort of draw those out in a practical way, and then perhaps go from there. I really like that. So the second technique that Frankl talks about is paradoxical intention. And this is one that I remember as a young therapist learning about and even assigning to my clients. So like a great example of this is, I would have clients who had sort of generalized anxiety disorder, and they would come to me. And one of the things that I would do, the paradoxical intention piece, is I would give them the homework to worry every day from, say, 4 to 5 p.m. Like, okay, so, Mr. and Mrs. Client, your assignment is every day from 4 to 5 p.m., you are to worry as much as humanly possible. And the rest of the day, you're not allowed to worry. But every day from 4 to 5, just know that you have to spend that time doing that and only that. And of course, your client looks at you like you have 3 heads, right? I mean, they're like, this guy has lost it. But then inevitably what happens is, when they start, heretofore, worry has sort of been intrusive in their lives, right? Like it has sort of shown its head unwittingly. But when you assign them to worry, they recognize the futility and the silliness of it. And they really often came to the conclusion, like, why am I doing this?
Yeah.
Is there a place, paradoxical intention is kind of this reverse psychology would be like the common phrase for it. I don't see much of this in financial planning. Is there a place for paradoxical intention in the life of a financial advisor?
Absolutely. And perhaps I will convince you, we'll see, that this may actually be one of the techniques that more of the advisors who are listening are actually using and have been taught to use in the past. So for example, like let's use the example that's most likely to occur for our advisors. Somebody's managing investments. We know that investments go up and they go down. One of the things that I've been doing for many years is toward the end of an investment policy statement, whatever model has been determined that is most appropriate for that particular client, all the education and the discussion that's gone into that, once that model is determined, of course, they will already have in their mind this expectation of a rate of return that is above zero. Right? That's why we're doing this in the first place, because it has an expected rate of return that's above zero. Yet then I will show them like 3 or 4 figures that would be the worst case scenarios. So this model, its worst 12-month performance, its worst 3-year performance, its worst 5-year performance. And then I'll translate the percentages into the numbers that are their actual portfolios. So now it starts to become more literal. Now, we all know that hypotheticals are simply not nearly as powerful as genuine life experience. But I do believe this is an example that's at least hinting at paradoxical intention, where you're pointing them in the direction of something that is negative, reminding them of that, not just possibility, of that likelihood that this will happen again in the future. And I think that also gives us then the ability, Daniel, to activate two of the most powerful words in financial planning from a behavioral finance perspective. And that is remember when. Remember when we talked about this. Remember when the last time this happened. This is how we operated. And I think we can do this helpfully, going back to the other point about the challenges that we go through in life. So we need to be preparing clients for the inevitable. It could be a market downturn. That's definitely going to come. A disability may come. A divorce may come. A death in the family is definitely going to come at some point in time. And so by preparing people in advance for these things, even in the midst of, say, a great market upswing, and you're doing an annual review with a client who's ebullient over the great returns they've gotten that year, that's a good time to remind them that a down cycle is likely coming again. And it's not to be morbid, it's not to be a downer, but I do believe there's an element of paradoxical intention there, at least a whiff of it, that we may be using even without knowing it.
No, I think that's wonderful. And, we know the power of pre-commitments and sort of helping to inoculate our clients against bad behavior by helping them pre-experience it. And, you're absolutely right. Like a cool, calm, collected conversation in Tim's office is not the same thing as seeing your portfolio drop 20% in real time.
Yeah.
But it does prepare you for that. And frankly, it makes the advisor look good. It makes her look prescient, and it makes her look prepared and as sort of a sage guide to what's going to go on. So I do think that is a positive way to help people prepare. I always get really concerned when I see people rely too heavily on averages, right? Like, well, market averages 10% a year and I have X. And so if it goes up 10% a year for the remaining 30 years of my investment lifetime, well, that's not how it works. It doesn't get 10% a year.
Yeah.
It's so I do think that's a powerful way to introduce that paradoxical intention. So the final intervention of Frankl's is Socratic dialogue, which I think most people will have at least a passing awareness of. This is basically the process of listening in a thoughtful, unhurried manner, restating what you've heard, and then gently challenging misguided beliefs. Any tips, tricks, or tactics here? Any favorite questions you use when trying to sort of introduce this sort of Socratic dialogue?
I do have one for you, and I almost chuckle as I mention it, because I collected this earlier in my career when I spent the first half of my career on what is now, unfortunately, in some domains referred to as the dark side, right? Like the proprietary product-oriented side. Banks, brokerage firms, and insurance companies had a lot of great experience there. Yes, I did choose eventually to go independent, fee-only, fiduciary, all that good stuff. But I've learned a ton of stuff from being in that world. And one of them, I found out, ironically, years later, I think actually does a good job of this very thing and is rooted in behavioral finance, perhaps, even if accidentally. And it's called Feel, Felt, Found. Have you heard this one before?
I'm aware of it. Yeah, but tell us about it.
All right, let me talk you through it. I understand how you feel. I once felt that way too. I have found this to be the case. So I totally understand how you feel. You're immediately beginning with an expression of empathy, and it should also be a restatement of the assertion that the client just made, however incorrect, right? I understand that you feel whatever. For example, that you shouldn't pay thousands of dollars to an estate planning attorney to create a bunch of documents that you may never use, all because Congress just changed the tax laws again. I understand how you feel that. And let that land. Make sure that that's the case. I have felt that way too. and even giving an example of where you might have experienced that frustration as well after a life event or something changed in the tax law. But I have found that once I wrote that check and completed those most important documents in life, I felt a great sense of reassurance that even if I'm gone, my wishes will still go on, at least through those particular documents. Mm-hmm. So that might be an overly simplified approach to this, but I think oftentimes you'll see feel, felt, found do the job quite well. And it's a very simple framework for what I do think is an empathic approach that is somehow built on behavioral finance, although I'm sure it's by accident.
Yeah, well, there's lots to be learned on the dark side, and that's not so dark. That's actually quite, I think, quite appropriate. We have a 5-step process for communicating with clients in sort of ways that sticks. And the first 2 steps are empathize and normalize, right? It's feel that empathy and then normalize it. When I was training to be a therapist, this was one of the things that we were taught to do in every meeting. Normalize that behavior, which is not saying you have permission to do this indefinitely or it's good or whatever, right? But normalizing, I understand how you could feel that way is in and of itself such a disarming and such a powerful thing to say to someone. I think that's wonderful. Feel, felt, found.
Yeah. And Daniel, if I may add one other thing, I want to be clear. One of the challenges I've seen advisors have with approaches to life planning is that many of them will comment that it feels too soft. That hey, when am I supposed to actually come in and be the financial advisor I was trained to be? Basically asking in the nicest way possible, when do I get to tell people what to do? But I think that one of the things I learned, I don't know if you're familiar with the Arbinger Institute at all, but I've really enjoyed virtually every book they've ever written and have experienced and benefited from some of their trainings as well. And one of the things that I've learned from them is it's not just about being soft, but we can say hard things in ways that don't feel harsh. And so it's not about unnecessarily softening the financial planning process. It's not about never being direct when asked a question. It's not about never being directive. It's about creating a space where all of that is actually going to be more effective because the client is the one who is empowered. The client is the one who is impelled rather than compelled by us in our recommendations.
So we promised book recommendations on this show. So the Arbinger Institute is sprung from the work of a professor at my alma mater. He wrote a book called Bonds That Make Us Free, which is one of my favorite books of all time. It has a decidedly religious sort of Christian perspective. And what a group of business leaders did was they read this book and they said, look, a lot of these ideas are powerful, but they need to be sort of, if it's going to reach the broadest audience possible, it needs
secularized,
it needs to be sort of taken, the religious valence needs to be taken from it. And we need to put it in sort of more neutral terms. And then we got the book Leadership and Self-Deception, which I cannot recommend enough. I mean, that book is just wonderful, but the Arbinger Institute's written interesting stuff on communication and even international peace. And
The Anatomy of Peace is another great one, but Leadership and Self-Deception is on my must-read list for sure. And I must read it every couple of years because we're all going to forget that stuff.
Yeah. Leadership and Self-Deception will, it should come with a warning. If you read it and internalize it, your life will change, but it will be hard. You will stop. You will no longer be able to lie to yourself and sort of promote your own infallibility and scapegoat and characterize other people. So bummer, but hard work, but deep relationships coming. Tim, you have been the absolute best. This is already, I can tell, one of my favorite episodes of all time. If people want to learn more about you and your work and your writing, where can people follow you?
Yeah. Well, Daniel, I pour everything I do right now into my firm based in Greensboro, North Carolina called Triad Financial Advisors. You can find us there at triadfa.com. Of course, you got my Forbes blog that's been out there for a while. If you just Google Forbes, Tim Maurer, personal finance, My website is timmaurer.com. And perhaps most important is that my last name has a funny spelling. It's Maurer. Not what you would probably think if you just heard my name. And then indeed, my last book, Simple Money, was my attempt at applying the wisdom of behavioral finance into the practice of personal finance.
Yeah, beautiful. Well, Tim, you've been an incredible guest. Thank you for sharing all this wisdom with us. And Tim and I are actually going to be starting a behavioral finance band. He has a fretless bass and a P bass behind him. He plays drums. We're gonna talk after this, and we're gonna start a band called The Irrationals or something. So Tim,
I'm ready.
Thanks for joining us, sir, and best wishes.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for tuning in to Standard Deviations. If you can't wait till next week for more behavioral finance insights, visit www.orion.com. All opinions expressed by Dr. Daniel Crosby and podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinion of or endorsement by Orion and its affiliates, subsidiaries, and employees. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for legal, tax, and investment decisions. The opinions are based upon information the participants consider reliable.